In the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, a young black couple walked into the county courthouse, their hands intertwined, their hearts racing. They weren't just any couple, they were both active duty service members who had met during their deployment in Afghanistan. Lieutenant James Thompson and Staff Sergeant Michelle Carter had faced countless challenges together, but nothing could have prepared them for what awaited them in that courtroom. The couple had come to file a discrimination complaint against their landlord, who had abruptly terminated their lease after discovering they were a military family. The landlord had cited excessive absences due to their deployments as the reason, despite federal laws protecting service members' housing rights. As they stepped into courtroom 305, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The judge, a middle-aged man with graying temples who had held his position for over 2 decades, barely glanced up from his papers. His demeanor was dismissive from the start, his lips curling into a subtle smirk as the couple began presenting their case. "And what makes you think you're qualified to challenge a legitimate business decision?" the judge asked, his tone dripping with condescension. A few chuckles echoed through the courtroom, and James felt Michelle's hand tighten in his. But neither of them flinched. They had faced mortar fire together, coordinated complex military operations, and saved countless lives. This courtroom battle was just another mission, and they were well prepared. Michelle stepped forward, her posture perfect, her voice steady. "Your Honor, we're here today because we believe in justice and the law. The same law we've sworn to protect with our lives." She pulled out a folder containing their military documentation, rental agreements, and a detailed timeline of events. The judge's smirk grew wider. "Well, isn't this cute? Playing soldier and lawyer at the same time?" More laughter followed, but it quickly died down as James pulled out his phone and played a recording. The landlord's voice filled the courtroom. "I don't want any military tenants. They're never around, and I can get better renters." The recording continued, revealing a clear pattern of discrimination against service members. The judge's smile faded as he listened. His face began to redden as Michelle methodically presented their evidence, citing the Service Members Civil Relief Act and various federal housing regulations. Her knowledge was impeccable, her delivery precise, skills honed through years of military briefings and combat situations. James then stepped forward, his combat medals visible on his formal uniform. He spoke about their service record, their deployments, and the challenges military families face. He talked about the nights they'd spent in foxholes, coordinating air support while thinking about the home they might not have to return to. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. The same people who had laughed earlier now sat in stunned silence. The judge's face had transformed from amusement to embarrassment as he realized he had grossly misjudged the couple standing before him. What he had dismissed as a simple landlord-tenant dispute was revealed to be a clear violation of federal law. The couple he had laughed at were decorated war heroes who had not only served their country with distinction but had also taken the time to thoroughly understand their legal rights. The evidence was overwhelming. The landlord's discrimination was blatant, and the couple's preparation was flawless. They had documented every interaction, gathered witnesses, and built a case that would have impressed seasoned attorneys. As the first hearing drew to a close, the judge cleared his throat, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible discomfort. He began, then paused, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I believe we need to take a short recess. When we return, I would like to hear more about your military service and the specific instances of discrimination you've faced." The young couple exchanged knowing looks. They had faced prejudice before, in the military, in their neighborhood, and now in this courtroom. But they had learned to fight back with dignity, preparation, and an unwavering belief in justice. As they stepped out of the courtroom for the recess, other people waiting for their cases approached them, offering words of support and gratitude. Many were fellow veterans who had faced similar discrimination but hadn't known how to fight back. The story of what happened in courtroom 305 that day would soon spread throughout the military community, becoming a beacon of hope for other service members facing housing discrimination. But for James and Michelle, it was just the beginning of their fight for justice, and they were prepared for the long battle ahead. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The judge's chambers had clearly given him time to research the couple's military background, and his demeanor had shifted from condescending to almost deferential. But James and Michelle weren't interested in deference, they wanted justice. The landlord, Mr. Peterson, sat nervously at his table, flanked by his attorney who kept whispering urgently in his ear. The confident smirk he had worn earlier had vanished, replaced by a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Staff Sergeant Carter," the judge began, his voice notably more respectful, "please continue with your testimony about the pattern of discrimination you've observed." Michelle stood, her bearing military straight. She pulled out a small notebook, worn from years of carrying it in her uniform pocket. "Your Honor, this isn't just about us. During our investigation, we discovered 7 other military families who faced similar discrimination from Mr. Peterson's properties in the last 2 years alone." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, his interest piqued. 7 families? "Yes, sir," James interjected, rising to stand beside his wife. "We have affidavits from each family." He handed a thick folder to the court clerk. 3 Army, 2 Air Force, and 2 Marine Corps families. All received similar termination notices within months of deployment orders. The judge began flipping through the documents, his frown deepening with each page. The landlord's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Michelle continued, her voice steady but passionate. "One family, Your Honor, had to live in their car for 2 weeks after returning from deployment. Another had to send their children to live with grandparents because they couldn't find housing on such short notice. These aren't just legal violations, these are real people, real families being torn apart." She then shared their own story, how they had met in Afghanistan during a joint operation between their units. How they had fallen in love while coordinating medical evacuations under enemy fire. How they had dreamed of building a life together, only to face discrimination at home that they never experienced in the military. "In the service," James added, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "we learn that rank doesn't matter when you're in the field. What matters is character, competence, and commitment. We didn't face housing discrimination in the military. We didn't face it in the war zone. We faced it here, at home, where we're supposed to be protected by the very laws we risk our lives to defend." The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Peterson," he addressed the landlord directly, "do you have any response to these allegations?" The landlord stood, his attorney trying unsuccessfully to keep him seated. "Your Honor, this is just business. Military tenants are unreliable. They deploy, they transfer, they serve their country," the judge interrupted, his voice sharp. "They put their lives on the line so you can have the freedom to run your business. And you repay that service with discrimination?" The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversation ceased. Mr. Peterson's attorney quickly jumped in, "Your Honor, perhaps we could discuss a settlement." "A settlement?" Michelle's voice cut through the tension. "This isn't about money, counselor. This is about changing a system that fails to protect those who protect it." She pulled out one final piece of evidence, a map of the city marked with dozens of red dots. Each of these points represents a complaint from a military family about housing discrimination. Not just from Mr. Peterson, but from landlords across the city. "This is a systemic problem, Your Honor, and it needs a systemic solution." The judge studied the map intently, then looked at the young couple before him. He saw not just 2 service members fighting for their rights, but representatives of countless others who had faced similar discrimination in silence. "Lieutenant Thompson, Staff Sergeant Carter," the judge addressed them formally, "what remedy are you seeking from this court?" James and Michelle exchanged a look before James responded, Your Honor, we're requesting 3 things. First, an immediate injunction preventing Mr. Peterson from terminating any military family's lease based on deployment or military status. Second, a court-ordered review of all his properties for similar violations. And third, the establishment of a monitoring system to ensure compliance with military housing protection laws. The judge nodded slowly, thoughtfully. And the other families? The ones who submitted affidavits? We're asking for retroactive damages for them as well, Michelle added. Not for profit, but to establish a support fund for military families facing housing discrimination. We want to turn this experience into something positive for our community. The landlord's face had turned pale. His attorney was frantically scribbling notes, likely calculating the potential costs of such remedies. As the session drew to a close, the judge made an unusual announcement. I'm ordering a 1-week recess. During this time, I expect Mr. Peterson and his counsel to review all military tenant records from the past 5 years. When we reconvene, I want a full accounting of every lease termination involving service members. He paused, looking directly at the landlord. And Mr. Peterson, I strongly suggest you use this time to reflect on the meaning of patriotism and service. Outside the courtroom, James and Michelle were surrounded by well-wishers, including several military families who had come to support them. Local news reporters had gotten wind of the case, and cameras flashed as the couple emerged from the courthouse. But they weren't interested in publicity. They had a mission, and like every mission they'd undertaken in their military careers, they would see it through to completion. As they walked down the courthouse steps, hand in hand, they knew this battle was bigger than just their case. It was about standing up for every service member who had ever faced discrimination, about ensuring that the promise of equal protection under the law wasn't just words on paper, but a living reality. During the week-long recess, James and Michelle's story spread like wildfire through both traditional and social media. Their fight had struck a chord with people across the country, particularly in military communities. But it was what happened 3 days into the recess that truly changed the game. The couple was having breakfast at their favorite diner when an elderly man approached their table. His weathered face and proud bearing marked him as a veteran long before he introduced himself. Lieutenant Thompson, Staff Sergeant Carter, he said, standing straight despite his advanced age. I'm retired Colonel Robert Wilson. I served in Vietnam, and I've been following your case. They invited him to sit, and what he shared next left them stunned. Colonel Wilson had been a military housing officer in the 1970s, and he had documented decades of systematic discrimination against service members, particularly minorities. He had boxes of records stored in his home office, evidence that this problem wasn't new, but part of a long-standing pattern. I tried to fight it back then, the colonel explained, his voice heavy with old frustration. But nobody wanted to listen. They said it was just business, just the way things were. I've been waiting 50 years for someone to take this on properly. That evening, James and Michelle found themselves in the colonel's home office, surrounded by yellowed papers and faded photographs. Each document told a story: a black airman denied housing in 1975, a Hispanic Marine family evicted while deployed in 1982, an Asian American Navy couple rejected from multiple properties in 1991. The more things change, the more they stay the same, Michelle murmured, carefully examining a particularly poignant letter from a soldier's widow who had been forced out of her home after her husband was killed in Vietnam. The colonel's documentation was meticulous. He had names, dates, locations, and even correspondence with various housing authorities. Most importantly, he had proof that many of today's discriminatory practices had deep historical roots. James called their lawyer immediately. This isn't just about current discrimination, he explained excitedly. This is about decades of systemic issues that nobody has addressed. We need to amend our complaint. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Their small apartment became command central as they worked to integrate the historical evidence with their current case. Veterans from different eras began showing up, each with their own stories to share. One afternoon, a young reporter from the local news station arrived to interview them. "What made you decide to fight this battle?" she asked, her camera rolling. Michelle looked at James before responding. "You know, in Afghanistan, we learned that the strongest weapon isn't your rifle, it's unity. When we coordinated medical evacuations, it didn't matter what branch of service you were from, what color your skin was, or what god you prayed to. All that mattered was working together to save lives." James added, "We're bringing that same principle to this fight. This isn't just about housing discrimination. It's about holding our society to the same standards of unity and equality that we live by in the military." The reporter then asked about their most challenging moment in service. The couple shared a knowing look, and James began to tell the story they had never shared publicly before. "We were coordinating a night evacuation of wounded soldiers," he began, his voice quiet but intense. "Michelle was managing communications from the forward operating base while I was with the ground team. We came under heavy fire, and our primary extraction route was cut off." Michelle continued, "I remember hearing the gunfire over the radio, knowing James was out there. But we had a job to do. I redirected air support, coordinated with nearby units, and helped establish a new extraction route. We got everyone out that night, no casualties. That's when I knew she was the one." James smiled. "Under the most intense pressure imaginable, she stayed focused, professional, and saved all our lives. How could I not fall in love with that?" The reporter was visibly moved. "And now you're fighting a different kind of battle." "Yes," Michelle nodded. "But the principles are the same: stay focused, work together, and never leave anyone behind. That's why we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for every service member who's faced this kind of discrimination, past and present." As the week progressed, their case attracted attention from civil rights organizations and veterans groups across the country. Their lawyer's office was flooded with calls from other service members sharing similar experiences. The local VA office reached out, offering to provide additional documentation of housing discrimination complaints they'd received over the years. The night before court was set to resume, James and Michelle sat on their small balcony, looking at the stars. The same stars they'd looked at during lonely nights in Afghanistan, dreaming of home. "Did you ever think we'd be here?" Michelle asked, leaning against his shoulder. James wrapped an arm around her. "Fighting for justice? Always. That's who we are. That's who we've always been." They spent the rest of the evening reviewing their updated presentation. Colonel Wilson's historical evidence had been expertly integrated into their case, creating a powerful narrative that spanned decades. They had statements from current service members, veterans, and military families, all sharing similar experiences of discrimination. But perhaps most compelling were the statistics they'd compiled, showing how housing discrimination disproportionately affected minority service members, creating a double barrier of prejudice. The numbers told a story of systematic exclusion that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents or business decisions. As they finally prepared for bed, their phones buzzed simultaneously, a news alert. Their story had been picked up by national media. The headline read, "Military Couples Fight Against Housing Discrimination Reveals Decades of Systemic Bias." "Ready for tomorrow?" James asked, setting his phone aside. Michelle smiled, the same determined smile she'd worn during countless missions. "Ready. The judge might have laughed at us once, but tomorrow we're making history." They fell asleep holding hands, their military IDs on the nightstand beside them, their evidence boxes stacked neatly by the door. Tomorrow would bring another battle in their ongoing fight for justice, but they would face it as they had faced every challenge, together, with courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to making things right. The courthouse steps were crowded when James and Michelle arrived for the resumed hearing. Veterans in their service uniforms stood in silent support, forming an impromptu honor guard as the couple walked up. News vans lined the street, and reporters held their microphones ready, but the couple moved past them with quiet dignity. Colonel Wilson was already inside, his decades of evidence organized in chronological order. The old veteran sat straight-backed in the front row, his presence a living bridge between past and present injustices. The judge noticed him immediately, recognition flickering across his face. They had crossed paths in legal circles years ago. Mr. Peterson and his legal team arrived looking notably less confident than before. They had spent the week reviewing their records as ordered, and the results couldn't have been comfortable. Their table was piled with folders and documents, but their body language suggested they weren't eager to share their findings. As the session began, the judge addressed the landlord first. "Mr. Peterson, are you prepared to present your review of military tenant records?" The landlord's attorney stood, smoothing his tie nervously. "Your Honor, after careful review, we've identified 43 cases over the past 5 years where military status may have influenced housing decisions. We're prepared to offer a substantial settlement to resolve." 43 cases? Michelle interrupted, standing up. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to present new evidence that suggests this problem goes far beyond the past 5 years." The judge nodded, and James wheeled in a cart loaded with Colonel Wilson's carefully preserved documentation. "Your Honor, we've discovered evidence of systematic discrimination against service members dating back to 1970. With us today is retired Colonel Robert Wilson, who served as a military housing officer and documented these cases throughout his career." Colonel Wilson stood when introduced, and the judge gestured for him to come forward. For the next hour, the elderly veteran testified about what he had witnessed and documented over his decades of service. His voice never wavered as he described case after case of service members facing housing discrimination, particularly those from minority backgrounds. In 1975, he recalled, "I had a young airman come to me. He'd just returned from a tour in Southeast Asia, decorated for valor. But he couldn't find housing for his family because landlords claimed his military status made him unreliable. The real reason? He was black, and they used his service as an excuse to deny him housing." The colonel's testimony painted a damning picture of decades-long discrimination masked as business practices. As he spoke, Michelle and James distributed copies of his meticulously maintained records to the court. The judge studied the documents intently, occasionally looking up at Mr. Peterson, whose face grew increasingly pale. "These patterns," the judge noted, "are remarkably similar to the current complaints." James stood to connect the historical evidence to their present case. "Your Honor, what we're seeing today isn't new. It's the continuation of a long-standing practice of using military service as a pretext for discrimination. The only difference is that today, we have laws specifically prohibiting this behavior, laws that Mr. Peterson has systematically violated." The landlord's attorney attempted to object, arguing that historical cases weren't relevant to the current proceedings, but the judge overruled him. On the contrary, the judge stated, "This historical context is crucial for understanding the systemic nature of these violations." Michelle then presented their updated statistical analysis. In Mr. Peterson's properties alone, military families faced lease termination rates 3 times higher than civilian tenants. For minority military families, the rate was 5 times higher. This isn't coincidence, it's a pattern. She projected a series of graphs onto the courtroom screen, showing the correlation between deployment orders and lease terminations. The data was undeniable, and the judge leaned forward, studying each chart carefully. "Staff Sergeant Carter," the judge asked, "how did you compile this data?" "Sir, we worked with other military families to review lease records, eviction notices, and deployment orders. We created a database tracking when families received termination notices relative to their deployment dates. The pattern emerged clearly. Notices typically arrived within weeks of deployment orders." The landlord shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Michelle continued. But what's most telling is what happened when families appealed these terminations. Non-military tenants who appealed lease terminations had a 60% success rate. Military families? Less than 10%. The disparity is stark. James added, and these are just the cases we know about. Many service members, especially those deployed overseas, never had the chance to challenge their terminations. They returned home to find their families displaced, their belongings in storage, their lives disrupted. The judge turned his attention to Mr. Peterson. Would you care to explain these disparities? The landlord stood, his previous arrogance replaced by visible nervousness. Your Honor, managing properties is complex. Military tenants present unique challenges. Challenges? Colonel Wilson's voice rang out from his seat. Like the challenge of defending this nation? Like the challenge of leaving your family behind to serve your country? The judge allowed the comment to stand, and the courtroom fell silent. The weight of decades of discrimination hung heavy in the air. Michelle rose one final time. Your Honor, we're not just asking for justice for ourselves. We're asking for acknowledgement of a systemic problem that has affected generations of service members. We're asking for change that ensures no military family faces this kind of discrimination again. She gestured to the veterans in attendance. Every person in uniform here today took an oath to defend this nation. We're not asking for special treatment, we're asking for the basic dignity and respect that our service has earned. We're asking for the protection of laws that already exist but haven't been properly enforced. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. The evidence before him told a story that couldn't be ignored, a story of systematic discrimination hidden behind policy and procedure, of prejudice masked as business practice, of service members fighting battles at home while defending their country abroad. I believe, the judge finally said, we need to take a brief recess. When we return, I'd like to hear specific proposals for systemic remedies. It's clear that this case has implications far beyond the immediate parties involved. As the courtroom began to clear, James and Michelle exchanged glances with Colonel Wilson. The old veteran gave them a slight nod, pride evident in his eyes. Their case had become something larger than themselves. It had become a vehicle for addressing decades of injustice, a chance to create real change for future generations of service members. Outside the courtroom, reporters clamored for comments, but the couple remained focused. They had learned in the military that the mission wasn't over until it was over, and they weren't about to lose focus now, not when they were so close to achieving something truly meaningful. During the recess, the courthouse hallway buzzed with activity. Military families huddled together, sharing stories that echoed the evidence presented in court. James and Michelle found themselves surrounded by fellow service members, each offering suggestions for systemic changes that could prevent future discrimination. A young Navy corpsman approached them, her uniform crisp despite the long day in court. I was denied housing last year while deployed, she shared. I thought I was alone until I saw your story on the news. My whole unit has been following your case. Before the session resumed, their lawyer helped them organize the proposed remedies into a comprehensive plan. They knew this moment wasn't just about winning a case, it was about creating lasting change. As everyone filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The judge's earlier request for systemic remedies had given them an opportunity they couldn't waste. Michelle squeezed James's hand as they took their seats, both feeling the weight of responsibility on their shoulders. Your Honor, James began as he stood, we've prepared a detailed proposal for systemic remedies that we believe will address both the historical and current patterns of discrimination. He distributed copies to the court, the defense, and the judge. Our proposal has 5 key components, Michelle continued, stepping forward. First, we're requesting the establishment of a military housing oversight committee in every county with significant military population. This committee would include active duty service members, veterans, and civilian housing experts. The judge leaned forward, clearly interested. And the committee's role would be? They would review housing complaints, monitor compliance with military protection laws, and have the authority to conduct surprise inspections of properties with a history of discrimination, James explained. Think of it like a civilian version of a military inspection, thorough, regular, and with real consequences for failures. Mr. Peterson's attorney jumped up. Your Honor, this is excessive. My client can't be expected to. Your client, the judge interrupted, has demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination that spans years. Please continue, Lieutenant Thompson. Michelle outlined the second component. We're proposing a mandatory training program for all property managers and landlords who rent to military families. The program would cover military tenant rights, deployment protections, and cultural competency training. She shared her screen, showing a prototype of the training materials they'd developed. We've already partnered with several veterans organizations willing to conduct these training sessions at no cost to property owners. The third component drew audible reactions from the gallery. We're requesting the creation of a military tenant emergency fund, James announced. This fund would provide immediate housing assistance to service members facing discrimination or unfair eviction. It would be funded by penalties assessed against landlords found in violation of military housing protection laws. The judge nodded thoughtfully. And the fourth component? A transparent reporting system, Michelle explained. We're proposing a public database where military families can check a property's history of compliance with housing laws. Landlords with clean records would receive a military-friendly housing certification, creating a business incentive for fair treatment. The final component was perhaps the most ambitious. We're requesting quarterly audits of lease terminations involving military tenants, James stated. Any property showing statistically significant disparities in military tenant outcomes would face automatic review and potential penalties. The judge turned to Mr. Peterson and his legal team. Your response to these proposals? The landlord's attorney stood, looking uncomfortable. Your Honor, while we appreciate the thought put into these proposals, they would place an undue burden on property owners. We would counter with a one-time settlement and... No, Michelle interrupted firmly. This isn't about money. This is about changing a system that has failed military families for generations. She turned to address Mr. Peterson directly. Sir, you've seen the evidence. You've heard the stories. This isn't just about business, it's about supporting the people who risk their lives for this country. These changes would help you too, by providing clear guidelines and protecting you from potential litigation. The judge raised an interesting point. Lieutenant Thompson, Staff Sergeant Carter, how would these changes affect smaller property owners who might lack the resources for comprehensive compliance programs? James was prepared for this question. We've thought about that, Your Honor. The training would be provided free of charge, and we're proposing a graduated implementation based on property size. Small landlords would have more time to comply and access to resources through the Oversight Committee. Colonel Wilson, still sitting in the front row, raised his hand to speak. The judge acknowledged him with a nod. Your Honor, I've spent 50 years watching this problem persist because we lacked systematic solutions. What these young people are proposing, this is exactly what we needed back then. This isn't just about punishment, it's about prevention and education. The courtroom fell silent as the colonel continued. I've seen too many service members fight wars abroad only to come home and fight for basic housing rights. These proposals would give them the protection they've earned. Michelle stepped forward one last time. Your Honor, we're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for a system that ensures fair treatment. Every point in our proposal is based on existing laws and regulations, we're just adding accountability and enforcement. She gestured to the packed gallery. Every person in uniform here today represents countless others who couldn't be here. Some are deployed, some are training, some gave their lives in service. They all deserved better than what the current system provides. The judge studied the proposal documents carefully, occasionally making notes. The room waited in tense silence. Finally, he looked up. "I've seen many cases in this courtroom," he began, "but few have presented such clear evidence of systemic problems and such well-thought-out solutions." He turned to Mr. Peterson. "Your attempts to settle this case with money miss the point entirely. These service members are fighting for something far more valuable, they're fighting for change." He continued, "I'm going to take these proposals under advisement. I want to hear from housing authorities, veterans organizations, and property owner associations before making a final ruling. But I will say this, the evidence presented here demands action, not just compensation." As the session concluded, the judge made one final statement that sent ripples through the courtroom. "When I laughed at the beginning of this case, I was wrong. Dead wrong. What I've witnessed here is not just a legal argument, but a mission to correct decades of injustice. And like any military mission, it's been executed with precision, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to the objective." Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the couple, asking for comments. But James and Michelle's attention was on the group of service members waiting to talk to them, each with their own story, each ready to join the fight for change. They had transformed their personal battle into a movement for systemic reform, and while the final outcome was still pending, they had already achieved something remarkable. They had given voice to generations of silenced service members and created a blueprint for real change. The next 2 weeks transformed James and Michelle's living room into an impromptu command center. Veterans organizations, housing authorities, and military family advocacy groups all wanted to contribute to the proposed reforms. Their small apartment was filled with laptops, documents, and countless cups of coffee as they worked to refine their proposals. One evening, as they were reviewing feedback from various stakeholders, they received an unexpected visitor. The state's attorney general had taken notice of their case and wanted to meet. Over cups of steaming coffee, she shared something that left them stunned. "Your case has opened a floodgate," she explained, spreading out documents on their coffee table. "We've received over 300 complaints of similar discrimination in just the past week. This isn't just happening in our state, it's nationwide." The Attorney General had brought data from other states showing identical patterns of discrimination. "What you've uncovered here," she continued, "could be the catalyst for federal reform. We're preparing to coordinate with other state AGs to address this on a national level." James and Michelle exchanged glances, the weight of this revelation settling over them. What had started as their personal fight for justice had unveiled a national crisis hiding in plain sight. The next morning, they received another significant call. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs wanted to participate in the next court session. Their case had caught the attention of the highest levels of government, and suddenly, their small courthouse battle had implications far beyond what they'd imagined. As they prepared for the next hearing, more stories flooded in. A Marine Corps family in California shared how they'd been evicted while the husband was recovering from combat wounds. An Air Force technician in Texas described losing her housing while deployed, her teenage children forced to change schools mid-semester. Each story added another layer of urgency to their mission. Colonel Wilson had become a regular presence in their preparations, his decades of experience providing valuable perspective. One evening, as they were reviewing the latest proposals, he shared something that brought tears to Michelle's eyes. "Back in '75, he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I had this young airman come to me. His family was living out of their car after being evicted. I couldn't help him then, didn't have the legal framework, didn't have the support. He eventually left the service because of it." He paused, pulling out an old photograph. "That airman was my brother." The personal cost of housing discrimination became even clearer when they received a letter from a Gold Star family. Their son had been killed in action, and within months of his death, his widow and young children had faced eviction. The property manager had claimed that without the service member's income, they couldn't ensure rent payment, despite the family's access to survivor benefits. Their lawyer helped them incorporate these new stories and statistics into their presentation. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't just about individual landlords or isolated incidents. It was about a systemic failure to protect those who served their country. The day before the next hearing, James and Michelle visited the local VA hospital. They wanted to hear from veterans who couldn't make it to court. In the rehabilitation ward, they met a young soldier who had lost both legs in combat. He shared how he'd been denied housing because the landlord claimed his wheelchair would damage the property. "You know what hurts more than losing my legs," he told them, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "Coming home to find out I'm not welcome in the country I sacrificed them for." That evening, as they prepared their updated presentation, Michelle couldn't stop thinking about all the stories they'd heard. "We're not just fighting for housing rights anymore," she told James. "We're fighting for dignity. For respect. For everything these service members have earned." James nodded, adding another statistic to their presentation. "Look at this, 67% of minority service members report facing housing discrimination at least once during their service. For non-minority service members, it's 42%. Both numbers are too high, but the disparity is telling." Their proposal had evolved based on the feedback they'd received. They'd added provisions for disabled veterans, expanded protections for Gold Star families, and included mechanisms for interstate cooperation in enforcement. The morning of the hearing arrived with a sense of historic significance. The courthouse was packed, not just with local supporters, but with military families who had traveled from across the country. The media presence had grown, with national networks setting up their cameras outside. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs arrived early, choosing to sit among the service members rather than in the reserved section. His presence sent a clear message: this case had implications for every service member, past and present. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Mr. Peterson and his legal team looked distinctly uncomfortable, especially when they saw the Attorney General and VA Secretary in attendance. The judge entered, his demeanor markedly different from that first day when he had laughed at the young couple. He carried himself with a gravity that suggested he fully understood the historic nature of these proceedings. "Before we begin," he announced, "I want to acknowledge something. This case has revealed systemic issues that go far beyond what was initially presented. What started as a housing discrimination complaint has exposed a national pattern of injustice that demands attention." He turned to James and Michelle. "Lieutenant Thompson, Staff Sergeant Carter, your dedication to addressing not just your own situation, but the broader systemic issues affecting all service members, is commendable. You've transformed a personal grievance into a movement for national reform." As Michelle stood to present their updated proposals, she felt the support of every person in that courtroom. Behind her sat Colonel Wilson, the Attorney General, and the VA Secretary. Around her were hundreds of service members and their families, each with their own story of discrimination, each looking to her and James for hope. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and strong, "what we present today isn't just a set of proposals. It's a blueprint for ensuring that no service member ever has to choose between serving their country and securing stable housing for their family." The next phase of their fight was about to begin, and they were ready. They had transformed from a couple seeking justice into leaders of a movement for change, their military training serving them well in this new kind of battle. As Michelle began detailing their expanded proposals, she knew that regardless of the outcome, they had already succeeded in bringing this critical issue into the national spotlight. The hearing room fell silent as the Secretary of Veterans Affairs rose to speak. His presence had transformed this local courthouse into ground zero for a national movement, and everyone knew his words would carry significant weight. "Your Honor," he began, "I've reviewed the proposals presented by Lieutenant Thompson and Staff Sergeant Carter. What they've uncovered isn't just a local issue, it's a national crisis that has gone unaddressed for far too long. The VA is prepared to throw its full support behind these reforms." He turned to face the gallery, his expression somber. "Every year, we see thousands of veterans transition out of service. They face enough challenges without having to worry about housing discrimination. What this couple has done is shine a light on a dark corner of American society that we can no longer ignore." The Attorney General was next to speak. She presented findings from a hastily assembled task force that had investigated housing discrimination against service members across the state. The numbers were damning. Military families faced eviction rates 3 times higher than civilian families, with minority service members bearing the brunt of the discrimination. "We've already begun coordinating with other states," she announced. 12 state attorneys general have pledged to form an interstate commission to address this issue. What began in this courtroom has sparked a national conversation about how we treat our service members. Mr. Peterson's legal team looked increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of the case continued to expand. Their client had become the face of a systemic problem that went far beyond his own properties, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that fact. During a brief recess, James and Michelle found themselves surrounded by reporters in the courthouse hallway. But it was a quiet conversation with a young private that truly captured the impact of their fight. "My wife is due with our first child next month," the private shared, his voice trembling slightly. "We've been living with her parents because no one will rent to us. They say my deployment schedule makes me an unreliable tenant. But watching you two fight, it gives us hope." Back in session, Michelle presented their expanded proposals, now backed by the VA and multiple state governments. "Your Honor, we've refined our recommendations based on feedback from stakeholders across the country. We're no longer just talking about local oversight, we're proposing a comprehensive national framework for protecting military families." The new proposals included a federal database tracking landlords with histories of discriminating against service members, mandatory reporting requirements for property management companies, enhanced penalties for violations, with funds directed to veteran housing assistance programs, expedited legal processes for military tenants facing discrimination, special protections for wounded warriors and Gold Star families, interstate cooperation in enforcement and oversight. Colonel Wilson, who had become something of a grandfather figure to the movement, stood to provide historical context. "In my 50 years of documenting these cases, I've never seen such a comprehensive approach to solving this problem. This isn't just about punishing bad actors, it's about creating a system that works for everyone." The judge, who had once laughed at the couple, now leaned forward with intense interest. "Mr. Peterson," he addressed the landlord directly, "do you understand that you've become the catalyst for a national movement?" The landlord shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but for the first time since the case began, Mr. Peterson waved him off and stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice surprisingly subdued, "I've spent the last few weeks listening to these stories, reviewing the evidence, and I was wrong. Not just about Lieutenant Thompson and Staff Sergeant Carter, but about everything. I'd like to volunteer my properties as a pilot program for these reforms." A murmur ran through the courtroom. James and Michelle exchanged surprised glances. This was an unexpected turn, but it represented exactly the kind of change they were fighting for. The judge nodded appreciatively. "Sometimes," he said, "the greatest victory isn't in defeating an opponent, but in transforming them into an ally." The Secretary of Veterans Affairs seized the moment. "Mr. Peterson, would you be willing to share your experiences with other property owners? Your perspective could be valuable in helping others understand the importance of these reforms." The landlord nodded, looking directly at James and Michelle for the first time without hostility. "Yes, I would. These past weeks have been educational. I've learned things about the challenges military families face that I never considered before." Michelle stood, her military bearing perfect as always. "Your Honor, this case has never been about punishment. It's about creating positive change. Mr. Peterson's offer to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem is exactly what we've been working toward. James added, we'd be willing to work with Mr. Peterson to develop best practices for property owners. His properties could serve as a model for military-friendly housing nationwide. The Attorney General quickly supported this approach. We could use this as a case study for our interstate commission. Show other property owners that these reforms aren't just about compliance, they're about doing what's right for our service members. The judge looked around the packed courtroom, taking in the scene. Television cameras had been allowed in for this historic session, broadcasting the proceedings to millions. What had started as a simple discrimination case had evolved into something much more significant. Before we proceed, the judge announced, I want to acknowledge something. When this case began, I made the grave error of prejudging these two service members. I laughed at them. That laughter reflected deep-seated biases that have no place in our justice system or our society. He continued, his voice carrying the weight of his words. But these two remarkable individuals didn't just prove me wrong, they turned their personal fight into a movement that will benefit service members for generations to come. They've shown us that true leadership isn't about rank or position, it's about having the courage to stand up for what's right and the wisdom to transform opposition into opportunity. As the day's session drew to a close, James and Michelle stood together at the podium, their hands clasped. They had entered this courthouse weeks ago seeking justice for themselves. They would leave it as the architects of national reform, their military training and dedication having served them in ways they never expected. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where hundreds of service members and their families waited to hear the latest developments. The couple emerged to thunderous applause, but their mission wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. 1 year after the landmark case began, James and Michelle stood in the rotunda of the state capitol. Behind them hung a massive banner, Military Housing Protection Act signing ceremony. The room was packed with service members, lawmakers, and media representatives, all gathered to witness the culmination of their fight for justice. The morning had begun with a special ceremony at their old courthouse, where the judge who had once laughed at them unveiled a commemorative plaque. It read, in honor of Lieutenant James Thompson and Staff Sergeant Michelle Carter, whose courage transformed a moment of prejudice into a movement for justice. Their fight reminds us that true service to our country knows no boundaries. Colonel Wilson, now serving as the chairman of the newly established Military Housing Oversight Commission, sat in the front row of the Capitol ceremony. His decades of documented cases had become the foundation for the new legislation, ensuring that future generations of service members would be protected. A year ago, Michelle began her speech, her voice carrying through the rotunda, we walked into a courtroom seeking justice for ourselves. Today, we stand here watching that small spark ignite a national transformation in how America treats its service members. The changes they had achieved were substantial. Mr. Peterson's properties, now a model of military-friendly housing, had become a case study in successful reform. The pilot program had exceeded all expectations, with vacancy rates dropping and tenant satisfaction soaring. Other property owners had taken notice, realizing that supporting military families wasn't just the right thing to do, it was good business. James stepped up to the podium next. This act isn't just about housing protection, he explained. It's about recognizing that when someone raises their hand to serve this nation, they shouldn't have to fight another battle at home. The Military Housing Protection Act had incorporated all of their original proposals and more. It established a nationwide database of military-friendly housing, strict penalties for discrimination against service members, special protections for deployed personnel and their families, emergency housing assistance funds, mandatory cultural competency training for property managers, interstate cooperation in enforcement. But perhaps most significantly, it had created a ripple effect. Other states had begun passing similar legislation, and Congress was considering federal reforms based on their model. The movement they had started showed no signs of slowing down. The young private they had met in the courthouse hallway a year ago was also present at the ceremony, now holding his infant daughter. His family had been among the first to benefit from the Emergency Housing Assistance Program, and they had finally found a stable home. "My daughter will never know what it's like to live in fear of eviction because her daddy serves his country," he shared, tears in his eyes. "That's the real victory here." Mr. Peterson had undergone perhaps the most remarkable transformation. He now served on the Military Housing Oversight Commission, sharing his experience to help other property owners understand the importance of fair housing practices. His testimony before state legislatures had been instrumental in passing similar reforms across the country. "I was part of the problem," he admitted during his speech at the ceremony. "But thanks to the courage and persistence of two remarkable service members, I learned to be part of the solution. They didn't just change the law, they changed hearts and minds." The Attorney General's Interstate Commission had documented over 10,000 cases of housing discrimination against service members in the past year alone. But with the new protections in place, they were finally able to take meaningful action to address these injustices. "What Lieutenant Thompson and Staff Sergeant Carter achieved goes beyond housing reform," the Attorney General declared. "They showed us that justice isn't just about winning cases, it's about transforming systems." The Secretary of Veterans Affairs announced the launch of a national housing support program for veterans, inspired by their case. "Their fight reminded us that supporting our troops means more than just thanking them for their service, it means ensuring they have access to basic dignities like stable housing." As the governor prepared to sign the act into law, James and Michelle stood hand in hand, their military bearing perfect as always. They were no longer just soldiers fighting for their rights, they had become symbols of hope and change for service members across the nation. The judge who had started this journey with inappropriate laughter now served as an advisor on military housing rights, sharing his story as a reminder of how prejudice can blind even those charged with upholding justice. "Sometimes our greatest mistakes can lead to our greatest achievements," he reflected during the ceremony. "These two brave service members taught me that justice isn't about who you are or what you look like, it's about standing up for what's right, no matter the odds." After the signing ceremony, James and Michelle visited the VA hospital where they had first heard the story of the wounded warrior denied housing because of his wheelchair. He was there too, now serving as an advocate for disabled veterans' housing rights. "You didn't just fight for housing," he told them. "You fought for our dignity. You showed us that our service matters, that our sacrifices mean something." As the day drew to a close, the couple found a quiet moment alone in the Capitol garden. The same stars they had gazed at in Afghanistan now watched over their victory celebration. "Did you ever imagine," Michelle asked, leaning against James's shoulder, "that our fight would lead to all this?" James smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "You know what they taught us in training: adapt, overcome, and never leave anyone behind. We just applied it differently this time." Colonel Wilson joined them in the garden, his eyes bright with pride. "In 50 years of fighting this battle, I never thought I'd see this day," he said. "You two did what generations couldn't, you turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change." As they walked down the Capitol steps that evening, they passed dozens of service members and their families, each with their own story, each now protected by the laws they had helped create. Their military training had taught them to fight for their country, but they had discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in courtrooms and capitals. The laughter that had once echoed in that courtroom had been transformed into something powerful, a catalyst for change that would protect military families for generations to come. And somewhere in that transformation, a young black couple in uniform had shown America that true service to one's country sometimes means fighting for justice on unexpected battlefields. The stars continued to shine above them, the same stars that had watched over their missions abroad, now witnessing their greatest victory at home. They had entered a courtroom seeking justice and emerged as leaders of a movement, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a rifle or a tank, it's the courage to stand up for what's right, even when others laugh.